and welcome to the channel. Today I want to bring you a patch idea that I had when I first heard the song by Thom Yorke called Down Chorus. That song has a very simple structure in a chord progression with voicing between the bass and the chords, but it is on the tempo, the cadence of the notes, that I think the main emotional message is carried out. Therefore I had that idea, I need to try out to automate the tempo of that song on a patch that conveys this verge of falling feeling that you get from the song at every end of the bar. I am pretty sure that Thom Yorke has recorded this song on one of the Prophets, and the few versions I've found on the internet of Thom Yorke playing this song live, he actually uses a piano and he's playing the expression live. But my main goal with this patch was not to emulate the Prophet, it was really to try to get an automation of that tempo that creates that sensation of ever falling from the edge. And that's what I wanted to bring to you today. I will roughly divide this video into two parts. On the first part, I will give you a full overview of how to recreate this patch if you are interested. And on the second part, a few tips and tricks on how to play the patch to really get the tempo effect. So without further ado, let's jump into it. I will start with you here on the voice menu with a few settings there. What I have changed here is the analog FL to the value of 23, and also I've turned on the random phase to give this analog feeling to the patch. On stereo mode, I actually set the parameter to alter, and I have opened the stereo width to 36. Don't forget to turn the warm mode on to contribute to that feeling of the Prophet. Now, as I normally do, let's get started here with the mixer session so you see where my sound sources are coming from. I am using only oscillator 1 to a full volume of 128. I'm using ring modulation to the value of 27.5, and the noise is set to a volume of 63.1. We will look into the parameters of all these sound sources in a minute, so come with me. Let's get started with oscillator 1 here. The oscillator in itself is a very simple basic sound. It's a single wave, a sawtooth, and no changes in tuning or key track here. But what is really creating the timbre of this sound is modulation. So let's have a look at Mutant 1 to follow oscillator 1 signal path here. So Mutant 1, what I'm actually doing is to apply linear frequency modulation with my source on oscillator 3. And the objective of this modulation are two. One, to give a metallic sound to my oscillator 1, but also you will see what I have done in oscillator 3 there to bring more body to the sound, and it works kind of a sub-oscillator there with a lower octave to bring more body to the sound and also add harmonics. So again, frequency linear modulation to Mutant 1. My source is oscillator 3. The depth here is set to 55.8, 3% of feedback, and a dry wet of 22%. So now let's have a look into our modulation source here, oscillator 3. So despite of the fact oscillator 3 is not a direct sound source, as you saw in the mixer there were no volume to oscillator 3. Oscillator 3 is actually a sawtooth, but it's tuned 12 semitones below, and that is to cover that function of a sub-oscillator. But you will only hear its harmonics from the frequency modulation. You will not hear the oscillator 3 as a sound source directly from the mixer. It will be only in the composition of the sound. So now let's have a look into our two other sound sources from the mixer. If you remember here, I have used ring modulation and noise, so let's have a look at those. So my ring modulation has as its source 1, oscillator 1, and source 2, oscillator 2, which is also not directly contributing to the sound composition in the mixer, but is used here on the ring modulation. And my depth is set to 76.1 and the ring volume 27.5. 67.5 as we saw from the mixer. My type of noise, it's actually a blue noise, and as we saw on the mixer again, the volume was set to 63.1. And oscillator 2 is not used as a sound source, it's just used here as a source for modulation, and its configuration is very similar to oscillator 1. It's just a sawtooth that is not detuned with a key track of 100%. I will continue with you here on a signal path just so that we configure our filters, but you will see that this patch, it's a lot about modulation. That's where the magic happens. Let's have a look into the filters before we deep dive into our tempo modulations there. Here on filter 1, the type I have chosen is actually a low pass 1 pole. It's this very shallow curve just to clip some of the high frequencies there. And my cutoff frequency was set to 69.4. Try to keep the value of the decimals there if you want to reproduce the patch, since we get a few harmonics tuning from the cutoff frequencies of the filter. And you will notice here that in filter 1 I actually have a key track set to 37%. And here on page 2 for filter 1, you will see that my filter route is set in series and I'm not applying any drive from there. So now let's have a look into filter 2. And filter 2 is this type of low pass, band pass, high pass to be morphed. But if you look at my curve here again, it is in essence a mix between a band pass and a low pass filter here. Very little cut into the low ends there as well. So to achieve this effect I have a morph set to 33.8. My cutoff frequency is set to 57, and this filter is a little resonant with a value of 8.6 there, and my key track is set to 12%. So now let's continue following our signal path here, and let's have a look at the parameters for the amplifier. I have applied a lot of effects in this sound because in the original recording the oscillators are really muffled by the filter and they sound really in the back of the mixing. But in order to achieve this, I actually lose a lot of gain. So you see that my amplifier level here is quite high, is 85.6. And in order to compensate a little bit for that high gain, I actually added a lot of velocity envelope here, 51.9. And this is the type of spice that you should add to your taste on how you play, how heavy or light you play. But I felt like a lot of velocity here can contribute to get a distinction between your left hand bass sounds, which I tend to play harder for this song, and the melody played on the right hand, which I try to play it softer. But we can talk more about that on the second part of the video.
Hey guys, me with a big cold here from editing. I don't know why I forgot to mention envelope 2. But here you have the parameters. I have set the envelope to an attack of 10 milliseconds, no decay, full sustain at 128, long release of 768 milliseconds, no delayed, no hold, not quantized, not synced to BPM. So now let's go back to the patch.
Now let's have a look at the effects here. There are many. So first on the pre-effects, I have tried to boost a little bit my mid frequencies here. So I have used an equalizer and I have started from the flat preset, but I actually added low gain to a value of 2.6 dB, a little bit of high gain, 0.2 dB, and a lot on the mid gain, 4.8. My shower low I kept on 500 Hz and the shower high also kept on the preset 4000 Hz. With a dry wet of 46.2 here. Now let's have a look around the space effects. So now on the delay menu here, in the original song I don't hear a delay. What we have, it's a good reverberation curve. But what I realized when trying to mask those frequencies and pulling my oscillators to the back was that the delay was having good timbre applied to my sound. That is the main role of my delay here. But of course you can hear in my recording that it plays a rhythmic role as well. So for the delay, I have used the type pan delay, and you can see here that I'm synchronizing the delay time to my BPM. I will go soon there to the tempo settings before we talk about modulation, but you see that a lot of the tempo information for this patch are actually synced to the BPM of the song. No feedback here, and that's the tone magic that I was talking about in the beginning. Wet tone set to 7.0. It is synced to the BPM, as you can see on the time value there, fourth of a time, and a feedback tone also set to 32 here to mask the sound to the back, to get that muffled sound that I told you. And dry wet set to 47.1. Like I was mentioning before, the original recording has a nice reverb to it, and on my quest to give that sound that very muffled characteristic, in my reverb section here, I have chosen the reverb cloud, which is this more mystic effect of our Hydra here. And the values for my reverb are pre-delay on 0.5 milliseconds, a very long time of 5 seconds, again messing up with the tone with 30.5, high damp default 96, low damp default 0, and a dry wet set to 65.1%. Last but not least, here in our signal chain, I have applied a post effect of compression, and my compressor has no sidechain, a ratio set to 12.3 to 1, a threshold set to minus 28.8 dB, an attack of 18 milliseconds, release set to 234, an output gain of 128, and a wet dry set to 50%. And this is all about the signal chain here, what constructs the timbre of this patch. But like I told you before, this patch was a lot about its tempo and how to automate that performance. I made it also to make it easy to sing and play at the same time, but still get that emotional load of the tempo of that song. And what I wanted to build was this automation that gives you a cue on when are you supposed to change the notes. So let's see how this sounds. You see there, when I hold long enough, the time stretches and you get slower repetition of the notes. And of course, I have this modulation that is repeating the notes for me, so I don't need to press them in a tempo. I can focus on the performance and on singing. But the fact that the modulation automation slows the tempo for me, that's the cue for me to jump into another note. So I spend a lot of time trying to work out both the repetition, but also this idea of slowing the tempo at the end of every bar so that I could know, okay, this is the time to change the notes, but it creates that tension of losing tempo. That's when you jump into the next chord. So talking about tempo here, if we go to our arpeggiator menu, that's where you'll find the tempo knob, and this song is set to 139 BPM. So I showed you before that the delay was on sync with the BPM, but you will see that all my LFO modulations here are as well pretty much synced to the BPM. And in order to understand a little bit better what is going on here in terms of modulation, let's jump into the mod matrix. For the first time in a Hydrasynth patch, I almost got off LFOs here. For this patch, I have used them all. And I have tried first an approach of using step LFO, but then I rolled back and I got the best results actually using regular LFOs. If you have been following the channel, you know that I like to start from LFO 5 downwards, so I can use the vacant ones until we get to the pre-routed ones. And there you can see my first function here, or my first routing, which is LFO 5, modulating the pitch of oscillator 1. And this is set here in my mod matrix to a value of 5.8. 8. So the main function of this oscillator here is this detuning. And when I listen to the timbre from Thom Yorke's song, what I've noticed is that you have this ringing tune, this ringing modulation to the pitch, at the same time that you have a fluctuation, almost like a tape flutter that is changing the pitch of the overall sound sources there. And the role of LFO5 was actually around that ring modulation, giving that buzz to the sawtooth vibration there. So let's have a look of what LFO5 is doing here. So if we click on LFO5, this is set to a triangular wave to a very high rate of 71.53 Hertz. And again, this is really giving that noisy sound, almost frequency modulation there to the wave, and it acts also upon the harmonics. This effect is not synced to the BPM because it's working on the timbre and not the tempo of the song, and its trigger sync is set to poly. No delay, no fade in, no phase, and a smooth level there of 25.1. So now let's go back to the mod matrix here to have a look of what is going on in terms of the tempo modulations there. So the first thing I want to show to you in relation to the tempo automation is LFO4 setting the amp level to a value of 50.2. And let's have a look of what LFO4 is doing now. So LFO4 is set to a sawdown waveform to a rate of 32, and that's a very slow rate. And this is synced to our BPM, the tempo of 139, but it's triggered only once. So you see here that the trig sync is set to single. And this has to do on how I decided to play the patch, but we will talk more about this on the second part of the video. Just remember that this change, this modulation in volume, it's triggered and it's happening only once. The delay is set to 0 and fade in is also set to 0, but if you look at my phase here, this is set to 123 degrees, and I will show you again how this looks like here on the monitor. So if I click back, you'll see that this wave is slightly out of phase here. And the reason for that is that my idea was that the volume would drop the longer you hold a note. And this will contribute to that idea, that tension that the tempo will bring. So you have both a drop in volume and tempo at the same time to create that emotional end of every bar. And the level that the volume is being changed is set to 15.1. Remember, LFO4 is routed to the amplifier volume here on the mod matrix. The next LFO in our list here is LFO2, which is the one pre-routed to the amplifier. But this one is actually routed to my filter 1 cutoff frequency to a value of minus 24.8. So let's have a look of what LFO2 is doing. LFO2 is actually the one responsible for the repetition of the notes. So you see that when I hold the notes down, I had this triggering of the notes, and that is being done by this LFO, which is set as a saw-down waveform to a rate of 1/4 of our tempo here, and then of course the BPM is synced, and that's what is giving us the cadence of the notes. I don't need to trigger them every time and get this automated for me. But notice that the trig sync is also single. I'll talk more about that on the how to play part. The delay is set to 0, fade is set to 0, and if we look again to the LFO waveform here, it is out of phase. And that's to give you that syncopated effect of the notes every end of the bar. And my phase here was set to 61 degrees. The overall level that we are affecting the parameters here is 95. But if you remember here from the mod matrix, this LFO, it's actually not only triggering my notes, but it's routed to my filter 1 cutoff frequency. And that's because the filter is opening every time a note is triggered, as well as the note being played, of course. So let's have a look here on page 2 of my mod matrix, and you'll see that the same LFO2, it's also routed to my cutoff frequency of filter 2. Again, to give that opening of the filter. And in this case here, the value is set to 5.5. But now if you remember, when I am holding the notes in sustain here, the cadence of the notes, it's actually slowing down to the tempo at the end of my bar. Right? You have that slow down in speed. And what is doing this is this routing from LFO4 modulating LFO2 rate to a value of 0.2. So if you remember, our LFO4 is that sawtooth that is very slow, and that's the one that is controlling the cadence of the sound, and it's modulating LFO2, which is the playing of the notes to a rate of 1/4 of a tempo there, right? It is actually this modulation here that slower the tempo the longer you hold the notes to create that tension. The other thing that LFO4 is doing, it's actually controlling the noise volume from the mixer. And that's because what I realized was that if I let the noise outside of the volume control there, it will sound too loud, although it's very loud on the original recording. Since I have chosen in this patch to have that cadence of notes and everything dropping in volume, I had to include my sound source's volume there as well. So now let's go to our third and last page here on the mod matrix. So now if we look at LFO2 here, this one is routed to the oscillator 1 volume. And the reason behind that is because this is the LFO controlling the pace of our notes, as you remember here, at a rate of 1/4. And originally what I tried to do was that this LFO would control the whole amplifier volume. But the result of that was that every time a note was being played in repetition here, my reverberation and my delay were pumping together with the notes, and this was not the effect I wanted. So I actually had to skip the original connection between LFO2 and the amplifier and manually route LFO2 to my sound source volume instead. So if you look here in the amplifier section, there is no influence of LFO2 to the amp anymore, but manually what I did was to make this LFO to control the oscillator volume, and that's what is playing the notes repetitively every time you hold a chord. Last but not least, I've used LFO3 to try to create that tape fluttering pitch oscillation that brings this lo-fi characteristic to the sound. So here I'm routing LFO3 to oscillator 1 pitch again to a value of 1.2. But if you look at LFO3 now, this is a much slower LFO that is not really in sync with the BPM of the song, and that's because I wanted that fluctuation independent of the tempo of the song, right? So LFO3 here is set to a sine wave to a rate of 4.29 Hz, not synced to the BPM, with trig sync set to poly mode, 0 delay, 0 fade, no phasing at a level of 76.0. Okay, so let's have a quick recap. This is a simple patch in terms of the signal chain. We started with the voice menu here, setting parameters to make this sound more analog and a little bit on the stereo spread there. So this is a simple patch in terms of the signal chain. We have oscillator 1 here as our main sound source, the sawtooth wave, which is being modulated by Mutant 1 by frequency modulation with a source in oscillator 3 that is tuned 1 octave down to give us these harmonics in the modulation of our main oscillator there. And as a second sound source, we have here our noise, which also adds ring modulation with a source in oscillator 1 and 2. And oscillator 2 is not sounding from our mixer, it's just another sawtooth sawtooth, similar to oscillator 1, just used as our source for modulation there. From there, everything goes into the mixer, where you can see the blend of volumes there between our sound sources. And we are using the filters now in parallel. Filter 1 as a low pass filter, and filter 2 as this morph between low pass, band pass and high pass filter. And then the signal continues to the amplifier, where we also add the velocity from the keyboard to make the sound more expressive. We are using LFO2 here, but not routed to the amplifier. And what LFO2 is doing is triggering the notes when we hold the chord down. Right? Then we use pre-effects here to equalize the sound, to boost a little bit our mids and highs. And the signal continues to the delay, where we added delay as a rhythmic spice, but we used it a lot to muffle the sound even more. And the same here on the reverb, that is also being used to mask the sound even more. And the signal chain ends on a post effects, where we compress everything to make it even more compact. But remember that the magic has happened on the modulation there. So LFO5 is that very fast modulation controlling the pitch of oscillator 1 to bring that buzzing ring to it. LFO4 is our saw down, very slow, which is responsible for slowing the cadence of the notes and the volume when I press and hold a chord or a note. As you saw there, a slowing down and a slowing volume. LFO3 is then responsible for our fluttering sound, modulating the pitch of oscillator 1 to mimic a tape effect. And last but not least, we come back to our LFO2, which is the one that re-triggers the note every time I hold the chord, right? But okay, now you have the recipe to create this sound if you wish. But I think as important as the ingredients, you need to know the idea behind playing this patch so that it plays to your favor. And it's not difficult, but it has a few tricks. So the way I do it is that I always start with my right hand here, and I try to press the bass slightly stronger than the notes that I will play there. And as soon as I trigger the bass here, my clock is ticking for the bar, so that my LFO4 there will actually slow down the tempo of the song and a little bit lower down the volume as well. So you should count your bit from the moment you trigger the bass, and then you can hold your chord. And then you can hold your chord, but a tip here is that every time you re-trigger a note, you try to trigger completely in sync with the tempo, somewhat like this. Right? So I try to completely release my fingers and then press again, and that's because we had that single trigger on the LFO. So if I continue holding any notes of my chord here, that will also trigger the slowing of the tempo, and we don't want that. So again, I start with the bass with a stronger hit. Then you see that the automation works for you and gives you the clue on when to change to the next chord. And what is important is that you will repeat that formula for the next bass note and next chord. So completely release both hands before you trigger the next bass sound. So let's see how this works in a dynamic way. So you see there, if you release completely your left hand every time you are changing the melody here, you will get the cue from LFO4 on when to change to the next bass note. Release both hands completely so you don't risk to keep the clock ticking for the LFO4 here. So you re-trigger again on the next note, and again following that formula with a stronger hit on the bass and a softer touch on the melody there. So here you have it. I think this patch doesn't nail the timbre of the Prophet, but I spent a lot of time on that tempo construction, and one of the ideas was that I could create this automation to make it easier for me to sing along with the song, but also what I'm curious to do next is actually to try to apply this patch to other compositions, because there's a very powerful formula there which creates that tension on slowing and changing the tempo before you actually change to the next bar. So I'll see what I can come up with musically by using this automation trick here. I hope this one was interesting to you. It was for sure very interesting for me to try to program all this tempo logic. Thank you for all subscribers. Your support, your recognition gives me motivation to continue doing those tutorials. Let me know in the comments if you have tried this patch yourself. And as always, I would love to hear your contributions on how can we make these patches better. Maybe somebody out there can help me out on making it an even nicer timbre that resembles even more the original song. And thank you for watching. See you on the next one.